Unfortunately, this effort did not succeed. There are other things I could state about the psychiatric issues, and I will sum them up briefly by telling you that in the archives of general psychiatry, they show that there were much higher rates of anxiety, depression, suicide attempt, physical abuse, and substance abuse associated with participating in homosexual sex. Of course, these studies have found this before. And of course, the reason it was always claimed was because of homophobia. Well, the thing that was different about this more recent study was that it was done in countries which are very, we'll say, gay-friendly, such as the Netherlands, where they've had some form of homosexual union for at least 10 years. Therefore, that society is so friendly to the homosexual issue that for homophobia to be a reason for that is it's an untenable explanation. There's something disordered about the lifestyle itself. Lastly, I will deal with the issues of public health, and these are some which I think are the most damning and also the most damaging to our society as a whole. As I mentioned to you, back in the 1980s when I was in medical school, I found that homosexuality was the issue, excuse me, let me correct that and say AIDS was treated very different from every other public health problem we have. As you may know, public health is an academic discipline. It requires study. There is a body of literature. There are philosophies, there are theories which support its function. In other words, there are times when we can actually do something about disease. For example, when was the last time you saw a case of smallpox? You don't. When was the last time you saw a case of wild polio in this country? You don't. Because public health does have a manner of dealing with disease. Syphilis was a scourge of this nation back in days gone by. In fact, it was fatal and we had no reliable treatments. One of the treatments was mercury. As you may know, treatment with mercury, it turns out that the treatment was more toxic than the disease itself. And therefore, to keep it from going into the general circulation, what we did was require syphilis blood tests before marriage. And this exists in the state of Massachusetts to this day and in most other states. This had the role of giving a person who was going to be married to someone else the option of saying, you know, I don't think I want to marry this person because they have a disease which we don't have a cure for. Well, things have changed. For over 50 years, we've had a reliable cure for syphilis. We've had a reliable test and a reliable cure for syphilis. It's no longer fatal, but the law is still in the books. Before you get married, you get a syphilis test. However, when the HIV epidemic came along, it was treated as a political problem rather than a public health menace. And this has cost lives. It has caused suffering. It has caused the death of children. It has caused the death of people such as one of my personal heroes when I was growing up, Arthur Ashe, first black man to win a major U.S. Open tennis tournament. He died because he had heart problem, had a bypass operation, and got contaminated blood. Now, I want to talk about this blood issue a little bit later, but let me just move on to the whole problem of how AIDS was treated as political and not public health. So what we had was the development of something called safe sex. And this is something that we're all subject to now. The other thing you had was universal precautions. There are two big problems associated with both of those. Number one, safe sex. This was instituted, and the cornerstone of safe sex was to use condoms. The problem, of course, was nobody had done any testing to find out if condoms really stopped HIV. Nevertheless, it was thrust into the public lexicon, and now the word safe sex is in English, even if you go to France, you go to Netherlands, you go to Sweden, all of the places I've been. And they still, even in their native languages, when they want to talk about safe sex, they use the English words, safe sex, despite the fact that there was never any proof that the safe sex they were suggesting was effective in stopping the transmission of disease. Universal precautions has driven many people out of the medical field because we used to wear gloves only when you thought there was a high risk. But when you wear gloves all the time, you were constantly exposed to latex. And now many people have so sensitive to latex they can no longer function in the medical field. They can have anaphylactic reactions simply from putting a blood pressure cuff on their arm. So those are a couple of the public health issues, but there are further ones. Now, I can treat a woman or a man who has HIV, AIDS, which we know is incurable, universally fatal, sexually transmitted. I am by law prohibited from informing a spouse that they could become infected. By law. This has never happened before in the history of human public health until HIV came along. So this has a very severe effect. Furthermore, there was discouragement of universal testing for people at high risk. This means doctors were exposed to patients who they could have done something different about instead of being exposed to HIV. This means that spouses were exposed to each other, where they could have done something different if there was permission, duty to warn. You know, doctors have a duty to warn if somebody says, I'm going to do something to harm somebody else. Even in the confidential doctor-patient relationship, doctors have a duty to warn. This was accepted for HIV. E-X-C-E-P-T-E-D. Accepted in the case of HIV. In other words, the public health was endangered because it was treated as a political issue rather than a public health menace. And lastly, one of the saddest cases I can think of is the fact that because people did not want to be tested and did not want mandatory testing in certain situations, you had mothers who had HIV who passed it on to their young ones. A pregnant woman has a 40% chance of passing on HIV to her child. If she is tested, she can get 75 cents worth of medicine given at the right time, which will reduce the transmission rate down to less than 5%. So I'm telling you that across this country, thousands of infants were born with HIV, suffered with HIV, died from HIV, or had to give them toxic medicines because of HIV, because political activists chose not to insist on testing. 75 cents worth of medicine to save a life, save $16,000 a year worth of medicine, save the suffering, save the heartache of parents. Why? Because it was treated as a political issue. Which brings me to the last issue on the public health agenda for now, and that is the whole idea of transfusions. Perhaps you recall when the HIV epidemic first broke out and we figured out that yes, it has something to do with blood, there were activists all across the country who were insisting that we should not have people asking questions such as, have you participated in any high-risk sexual activity such as male-on-male activity? And this resulted in the death of people. People were encouraged. Gay activists wrote in newspapers, this is in black and white, in their archives, we want you to go down to the Red Cross and when you offer to donate blood, lie. Don't tell the truth. Lie. They ask you if you had sex with a man, say no, even though you have. Okay? This, you might think, was an antiquated idea, perhaps a little over-exuberance on the part of some activists in the early 1980s. Unfortunately, this is not true. As recently as a few days after 9/11, when everybody was in the spirit of civic responsibility, and what they did was wanted to help out, they wanted to donate blood, they wanted to do whatever they could. Published in the Harvard Crimson, one of our best and brightest universities, where the best and brightest go, where you expect serious academic discourse, where you expect serious intellectual inquiry. Someone actually sent out an email broadly and said, yeah, go down and donate blood. And when you do, if they ask you if you had sex with a man, lie. Don't tell the truth. Increase the risk to the public. So I think these are problems. Let me close with these two remarks, and I'll certainly be available to answer any questions. We're planning on staying here for a while. There is no gay gene. You will read time after time about gay genes, but it will always be the front page, back page treatment. And I have to commend people who are open homosexual practitioners, who are researchers, because they put out a piece of information, and they never said there's a gay gene. They put out a piece of information which they think may add to this argument. The newspapers get a hold of it and say, here's the gay gene. This proves it's inborn. This proves it's immutable and unchangeable. The researchers themselves don't make that claim, but the newspapers do. And you get the usual front page, back page treatment. The front page, gay gene found. Back page, 3 months, 6 months later, well, this research didn't really come to the conclusion. In fact, the researcher who gave us the data says that his research didn't say that, and the newspaper actually overstated it. And lastly, I want to deal with the 10% myth. It still goes around that there's somehow 10% of males or 10% of the population is homosexual. This data was first presented by Alfred Kinsey 50 years ago, and you may know there's a movie coming out with him in the next few months starring Liam Neeson, which presents him as some sort of sexual liberator, which has done wonderful things, one of which has resulted in 65 million Americans having an incurable STD right now. But it'll say that 10% of the population is homosexual exclusively. This number has never been replicated. You can't find any other studies that will say it, but still you have Project 10 in Los Angeles, which goes into schools and tries to tell people, yeah, if you're homosexual, it's okay. And the number is closer to about 2% with males and 1% with females. That's the studies, those are the studies that have been replicated. And with that, I will pass the baton over to Mr. Lafferty. Thank you for your attention.
Well, it is, to use a baseball metaphor, it's always hard to hit cleanup, but following Brian Camenker and Dr. Diggs, two very thoughtful and articulate people, the job is all the more difficult. Let me start by trying to put a couple of myths to bed. The first being that I know how to do microphones. The first being that Republicans are boring, humorless people. As a Republican, I felt a need to address that. First of all, when I was, like many of you, I was a member, I was an activist. In fact, I was the chairman of the Young Socialist Alliance at the college that I went to. And it was around that time that President Nixon made a very strange appointment to the United Nations. He appointed William Buckley to be part of the permanent delegation at the UN, which meant that Bill Buckley actually got to make speeches at the UN. And this is a nightmare for anybody connected with the UN, because Mr. Buckley had been a critic of that body for his whole life. His first day, he was invited to the UN Association, has a nice tea and luncheon, and he was invited as the speaker to give a sort of civics 101. Here's how we do things in America. And Buckley goes through this basic sort of, well, we vote and we do this and we do that. And all of a sudden, the hands of one of the diplomats shot up and said, wait a minute, you say that you work in New York, but you vote in Connecticut. And Buckley explained, well, you see, you know, our residence becomes the fixed address for the districts in which we vote. And he went through sort of a complicated explanation, which illuminated nothing for that audience. So this lady who was running the luncheon tried to be helpful and stood up and said, you see, Mr. Ambassador, in this country, we vote where we sleep, not where we work. And not to miss an opportunity like that, Mr. Buckley said, well, even that's not exactly true. Because if I voted where I slept, I'd vote at the United Nations. I hope that none of you have to return here at any time to vote in the future. Today, the Massachusetts Democratic Party attacked Brian Camenker in Article 8. And it was it looked to me like they were playing a parlor game. You know, one of those games where you're given 3 words and you're supposed to make up a sentence. Well, they got carried away. They did a whole press release and a couple of paragraphs on this. And their 3 words were hatred, bigotry, extremist. It seemed to me that every possible combination of those 3 words was jammed into this press release, and it was sent out. It typifies the way the debate over homosexuality in the United States is handled. And it seems to be a particularly hostile, bare knuckles affair here in Massachusetts. I'm a political consultant. I work throughout the United States in strange, faraway places like California, Florida, North Carolina, Texas, all over. And I have never seen the sort of strange behavior, strange political behavior that I've seen associated with this issue. When Ed and Sally Pollack asked for my help in the early 2002 on the petition drive, I came here and worked mostly with churches. That's my background. I represent a number of groups that are church-related, religious groups. And I talked with Catholic and evangelical, and I spoke at the Islamic Center here, and tried to talk with those people and find out what role they could play in this. When the actual Constitutional Convention started, well, let me start with the petition part of it. One day, someone said to me, hey, can you help? We need somebody to gather petitions at the Natick Mall. You know, would you go out there? So I went out with a guy named Bruce Hall, who was with Massachusetts Citizens for Life. And on